The sun hammering the settlement of Redemption was a physical force, bleaching the main street to the color of bone and baking the air until it shimmered. Inside the Redemption Land and Savings Bank, the air was only marginally cooler, thick with the scent of old paper-oiled wood and the fine red powder that coated every surface. Elias Carver stood before the teller's cage, his hat in his hands, the weight of a few carefully saved dollars heavy in his palm. He was a man built of lean muscle and hard silences, his face a map of sun-blasted plains and long solitary nights. He had come to Redemption to bury his past, but the past was a stubborn corpse. The bank was quiet, the only sounds the lazy buzz of a fly and the scratch of the teller's pen. Elias shifted his weight, the floorboards groaning beneath his worn boots. He was about to speak, to slide the coins across the counter, when the world shattered. The front door exploded inward, ripped from its hinges. Glass from the windows cascaded across the floor in a crystalline wave. A woman screamed a sound sharp and thin that was immediately swallowed by the ensuing chaos. 3 figures filled the doorway, silhouetted against the blinding white light of the street. They were masked, their forms blurred by dusters and the wide brims of their hats. Nobody moves. The voice of the leader cut through the noise cold as a blade. It was a voice that expected obedience, a voice that had been forged in violence. Elias instinctively dropped to one knee behind an overturned writing desk, his hand reaching for the revolver at his hip. But there were 3 of them, and he was one. The odds were long, and dying for the bank's money was a fool's errand. He stayed low, his knuckles white where he gripped the desk's splintered leg. The robbery was brutally efficient. 2 of the riders herded the handful of patrons against the far wall, while the leader vaulted the counter. The teller, a young man with a face pale as milk, raised his hands in surrender. Elias watched as the leader, a man of imposing height and broad shoulders, ignored the cash drawer. His movements were deliberate, almost contemptuous. He wasn't after pocket money. He was looking for something else. The lockbox, the leader snarled, his voice muffled by the bandana over his face. The one registered to the territorial surveyor. Open it. The teller stammered, his eyes wide with terror. I can't. It requires 2 keys. The leader's response was a swift, savage backhand with the barrel of his pistol. The teller crumpled to the floor, a dark line of blood blooming on his temple. The leader, Silas Kane, though Elias did not yet know his name, ripped a ring of keys from the teller's belt and began jamming them into the lockbox set into the wall. As he leaned forward, his saddlebag slung carelessly over his shoulder swung out and caught the edge of the counter. Something small and metallic tumbled out, landing on the floor with a muted clink. It skittered across the polished boards, spinning in a lazy arc through the dust motes, dancing in the sunbeams that pierced the gloom. It came to a rest directly in front of the desk where Elias was hiding not 2 feet from his hand. Time seemed to slow. The shouts of the robbers, the whimpers from the hostages, it all faded into a distant roar. Elias's gaze was fixed on the object. It was a silver locket tarnished with age, a simple hand-engraved floral pattern on its surface. He didn't need to touch it. He didn't need to see the tiny, faded photograph he knew was nestled inside. He knew its weight, its feel, the specific way the catch clicked shut. It had belonged to his younger brother, Daniel. The locket had been a gift from their mother given to Daniel on his 16th birthday. Elias had watched him polish it every Sunday, his head bent in concentration. Daniel had been wearing it the day he died, killed years ago, in what the Kansas lawmen had called a cattle rustling dispute gone wrong. They'd found his body in a shallow creek bed, his pockets empty. The locket was gone. Elias had assumed the rustlers had taken it. But here it was, dropped from the bag of a violent bank robber in a dusty settlement hundreds of miles from where his brother was buried. The world rushed back in. Silas Kane cursed, unable to open the lockbox. Forget it. Take what's in the drawer and let's ride. His men scooped handfuls of bills and coins into canvas sacks. The whole ordeal had lasted less than 3 minutes. As they backed toward the door, Silas's gaze swept the room, his eyes lingering for a half-second on the overturned desk. Elias held his breath, certain he'd been seen. But the riders' attention was already on the street on their escape. They vanished as quickly as they had appeared, leaving behind a wake of shattered glass, terrified silence, and the lingering smell of gunpowder. For a long moment, no one moved. Then slowly people began to stir. The woman who had screamed was now sobbing quietly. Someone helped the dazed teller to his feet. Elias remained frozen, his world narrowed to the small silver object lying in the dust. The robbery wasn't random. The man leading it was connected to the tragedy that had hollowed out his life, the ghost that had followed him across the prairie. His hand, trembling slightly, reached out. His fingers closed around the locket. It was cool to the touch, a cold piece of a past he could never outrun. The quest for a quiet life was over. Vengeance, he now realized, had found him. The weight of his brother's memory, once a source of quiet grief, now settled in his gut like a shard of ice. He had a face to put to his anger, a voice to haunt his nightmares. And he had a name to find. Elias Carver had spent 2 years on his homestead, a small hardscrabble plot of land carved out of the unforgiving prairie on the outskirts of Redemption. He had built the one-room cabin himself, its walls chinked with mud and its roof laid with sod, a testament to his desire for solitude. The land was his penance, a place to sweat out the guilt that clung to him like the fine red dust. The guilt of not being there for Daniel. The guilt of accepting the law's easy explanation of letting the trail go cold. He lived a life of deliberate routine, rising before the sun, checking the fences, hauling water from the creek, tending to his half-dozen head of cattle. The work was hard, the reward scant, but it kept the ghosts at bay during the daylight hours. It was the nights that were difficult when the silence of the plains pressed in, and the memory of his brother's easy laugh felt like a physical blow. He would sit on his porch, the silver locket now hanging from a leather cord around his neck, its cold weight a constant reminder. He replayed the robbery in his mind 1,000 times, searching for details. The leader's height, the specific pattern on his boots, the cruel confidence in his voice. He had made cautious inquiries in town, but fear had sealed the lips of Redemption's citizens. Sheriff Burke, an aging lawman with eyes that had seen too much and a weary slump to his shoulders, had offered little more than pragmatic advice. 3 riders masked and gone in minutes, Burke had said, leaning against his office door. That's a cold trail, Elias. And chasing ghosts is a good way to get yourself buried. Burke knew a little of Elias's history, enough to understand that the man was carrying a heavy burden. In this town, the sheriff had added his voice dry as dust, and there's the law, and there's what people believe. They ain't always the same thing. Elias had taken the warning for what it was, a suggestion to let it go. But the locket was proof. It was a thread connecting the violent present to his buried past, and he was determined to pull on it, no matter what unraveled. His grief, once a passive ache, had sharpened into a purpose. He began watching, listening, piecing together whispers and rumors. The name Silas Kane had surfaced, once spoken in hushed tones at the saloon, in connection with a string of failed homesteads north of Redemption being bought up for pennies on the dollar. The name meant nothing to him, but he filed it away. His isolation was a fortress he had built stone by stone. But one evening, as the sun bled across the horizon, a crack appeared in its walls. He was repairing the corral gate when he saw her, a lone figure walking in from the flats, her steps slow but deliberate. She was wounded, her dress torn, and hunger had whittled her frame, but she carried herself with an unbroken pride that defied her circumstances. His first instinct was caution. A stranger, especially an Apache woman, meant trouble. It meant questions from the town attention he couldn't afford while quietly hunting for clues about Kane. He considered turning his back, retreating into the cabin, and pretending he hadn't seen her. But as she drew closer, her face lifted into the fading light, and a jolt of recognition struck him with the force of a physical blow. It was Nayeli, the girl from his childhood, from a time before the bitterness had set in, before the soldiers had scattered her people, and Daniel had been killed. He remembered sharing bread with her by the creek, her quiet laughter a stark contrast to his own boisterous youth. He had often wondered what became of her family. Now she was here, a ghost from a different part of his past, scarred but alive. She stopped at the gate, her dark eyes meeting his, and he saw the fear she was trying so hard to conceal. If he turned her away, there was nowhere else for her to go. The wilderness that had failed to kill her would surely finish the job. "Don't you recognize me, Cowboy?" she asked, her voice quiet but firm, carrying across the still air. The words sliced through years of self-imposed silence. His jaw tightened. The easy answer was to say no, to push the gate shut and secure his solitude. But looking at her, at the dried blood on her dress and the exhaustion etched onto her face, he saw more than just a risk. He saw a reflection of his own survival, of a life pared down to its most essential elements. To turn her away would be a betrayal, not just of a childhood memory, but of the man he was struggling to become, someone who did more than just endure. He wrestled with the town's prejudice, with the trouble her presence would bring, with the added weight of another soul to worry about. Then he set the board he was holding down, walked to the gate, and pushed it open. He didn't offer a welcome, didn't make a promise. He simply stepped aside and gestured toward the cabin. His voice, when he finally used it, was flat but steady. "Sit." Nayeli crossed into the yard, her knees threatening to buckle with relief. For the first time in weeks of flight and fear, she felt a flicker of hope. She lowered herself onto the porch stoop next to a bucket of water and drank from the tin ladle with hands that trembled. Elias watched her, the hammer still in his grip, the weight of his decision settling upon him. He had just invited the very trouble he had spent 2 years avoiding. But as he looked at her, he knew with a certainty that surprised him that he would not have chosen differently. Her arrival was an intrusion, yes, but perhaps it was the one he needed to finally break out of the prison of his past. The cabin was a Spartan space, built for one man's solitude and nothing more. A narrow bed, a table with 2 chairs and shelves, holding the bare necessities for survival. The air was close-smelling of wood smoke and coffee. Elias motioned her inside, and Nayeli followed her steps, hesitant as she crossed the threshold. She knew the rarity of this gesture of a settler opening his door to one of her people. She took in the room with a quick, practiced eye, the neatly stacked tools, the orderly shelves, the bare board walls. It spoke of a man who worked hard and trusted little. Elias pointed to the table where a plate with the remains of his own meal cornbread, a piece of bacon, and a scoop of beans still sat. He gave a short, sharp nod. "Eat." The single word was an anchor in the swirling sea of her uncertainty. She ate slowly, taking small bites, her eyes downcast, as if she feared the plate might be snatched away. While she ate, Elias moved with a quiet efficiency, pouring water into a basin and setting it on the table with a folded cloth. The silence was thick, charged with unspoken questions. He finally broke it, his gaze fixed on the dark stain of the wound on her side. "You walked far?" "From where?" She swallowed before answering, her voice as level as the plains she had crossed. "From the river west of here. My people scattered after soldiers came. I kept moving east." She paused, the memory flickering in her eyes. I avoided ranchers, avoided dogs. I did not think I would reach another settlement. Her words landed heavily in the small room. Elias remembered the talk in town months ago of a skirmish of an Apache band being broken and driven out. He remembered his father years before cursing the soldiers and settlers alike for the cycles of violence they perpetuated. And he remembered the girl who had vanished with the others. Looking at her now scarred and thin, the old guilt twisted in his chest. He had done nothing then, had stayed silent, as her world was torn apart. Nieli finished half the food and pushed the plate away, careful not to seem greedy. She reached into a small pouch tied beneath her dress and produced a bone needle and a roll of sinew thread. With a steady gaze, she looked at him. I need to close the wound better. Part of him wanted to turn away, to leave her to the grim privacy of her pain. But another part, the part that had opened the gate, refused. Without a word, he lifted the oil lamp from its hook, set it closer to her on the table, and stood by his presence, a silent offer of support. She gritted her teeth as the needle pierced her skin, her breath hissing through her teeth. The first stitch slipped her hand, shaking with pain and weakness. Elias leaned in his large frame, casting a shadow over the table, and held the lamp steady. The golden light caught the sheen of sweat on her forehead. Take it slow, he said, his voice quiet, devoid of pity, but full of a gruff empathy. She found her rhythm, her hands moving with a grim determination. When she was finished, her face was pale, but her hand was steady. She tore a strip from the hem of her dress and wrapped it tightly around her ribs. Elias poured hot water from the kettle into a cup, adding a pinch of willow bark from his own small supply. He set it before her. She acknowledged it with a faint nod, a wordless thanks. The silence that followed was different. It was no longer the silence of strangers, but of two people who shared a past, and were now unexpectedly sharing a present. The question of her staying hung between them, unspoken. He was already picturing the whispers in town, the sheriff's watchful gaze, the trouble that would inevitably follow. He took the other chair, sitting across from her, his arms resting on his knees. He had spent years turning away from others, from any connection that might lead to loss. But she had survived weeks alone, had stitched her own flesh, had walked to his gate, fueled by the faint memory of a boy who once shared bread. This time, he didn't want to turn away. Outside, the corral gate creaked in the wind. Inside, the stove settled with a soft pop. For now, the open door was enough. The first sign of trouble arrived with the morning sun, carried by the storekeeper's 12-year-old son. The boy, sent on an errand, slowed his walk as he passed Elias's property. His eyes widening as he saw Nieli sitting on the porch stoop, mending a tear in her dress with the new cotton cloth Elias had bought for her. The boy stared long enough to burn her image into his memory before sprinting back toward the settlement, a messenger of disruption. Nieli saw him go. A knot tightened in her stomach. She had lived this story before. She knew how whispers turned to stares and stares to threats. Elias returned from checking the fence line, his face grim. He had seen the boy's tracks, had seen the urgency in them. He met her gaze, and no words were needed. It started, he said flatly. By noon, the prophecy was fulfilled. Two men, their faces familiar from the saloon, leaned against the hitching post in front of the general store, smoking and pointing overtly toward the Carver homestead. Their presence was a declaration, a line being drawn in the dust. An hour later, Sheriff Burke made his slow, deliberate ride out. His horse's hooves raised steady puffs of dust, each one a marker of the inevitable confrontation. Burke was a man who ruled by patience, not force, but his badge was a heavy weight in a town like Redemption. He reined in his horse at the gate, his expression unreadable. "Morning, Elias." His eyes rested on Nieli, who had risen to her feet, her posture straight, her chin up. Elias walked to the fence. "Sheriff, boy tells me you've got company." Burke said, his gaze shifting back to Elias. "You know how people here will take it. Doesn't matter if she's hurt or not. There'll be talk, and talk brings heat." "She hasn't broken any law," Elias replied, his voice a low rumble. "Didn't say she had." Burke shifted in his saddle, the leather creaking like a tired joint. "But I've got to keep order. If men decide to take it into their own hands, order gets harder to hold." It was then that Silas Kane's influence, a shadow Elias was only beginning to understand, made itself known. 3 men rode up behind the sheriff, their horses flanking him. They weren't the bank robbers, but they had the same hard, predatory look. One of them, a man with a jagged scar bisecting his eyebrow, spat a stream of tobacco juice near Elias's boot. "Sheriff's just saying what's right, Carver," the man sneered. "This here's a decent town. We don't need her kind stirring up trouble. Mr. Kane wouldn't like it." The mention of the name sent a chill down Elias's spine. So the whispers were true. Kane had men in town. Men who acted as his enforcers, subtly stoking the town's fears to serve his own ends. This wasn't just about prejudice. It was about power. Kane was using Nieli's presence to further isolate him. Sheriff Burke's eyes narrowed, his hand dropping to rest casually near the butt of his revolver. "I speak for myself, Henderson. And right now the law says Mr. Carver can have any guest he pleases on his own property. You and your friends can ride on." Henderson's eyes flicked from the sheriff to Elias, a clear threat in his gaze. "For now," he muttered, before turning his horse and riding away, his companions following like wolves at his heel. Burke watched them go, his mouth a thin, hard line. He turned back to Elias, his voice low. "You see, you've stirred up a hornet's nest, Carver. And some hornets in this town answer to a bigger queen. You've made a powerful enemy." After the sheriff left, the silence in the yard was heavy with the weight of the new reality. Elias looked at Nieli. Her shoulders had sagged slightly, the bravado she had shown the sheriff giving way to a weary resignation. "It begins the same everywhere," she whispered. Elias felt the choice pressing down on him, heavier than ever. Kane wanted him isolated, wanted him broken. Keeping Nieli was no longer just an act of conscience. It was an act of defiance. He thought of the locket of the cold-eyed man who had dropped it. He thought of his brother and the justice he was owed. He would not be pushed off his land, not by Kane's thugs, not by the town's fear. "You're not leaving," he said, the words more a vow than a statement. He looked at her, seeing not a burden, but an unlikely ally in a fight that had just become terrifyingly clear. Whatever Kane was planning, it was bigger than a simple land grab. It was a war, and she was now on the front line with him. The days that followed were a fragile truce, the air thick with unspoken tension. Elias and Nieli worked their movements economical, their conversations sparse but meaningful. They repaired fences, hauled water, and fortified the small homestead against 2 kinds of storms, one of dust, the other of men. In their shared labor, a tentative bond formed, woven from threads of mutual respect and a shared understanding of survival. Then the first storm hit. A brown haze on the horizon grew into a churning wall of grit, swallowing the sun and turning midday into a suffocating twilight. The wind howled like a banshee, tearing at the roof and driving dust through every crack and seam in the cabin. Inside, their world shrank to the flickering circle of lamplight. They worked in tandem, stuffing rags into gaps, their shoulders occasionally brushing in the cramped space. They were trapped, 2 solitary souls bound together by the fury of the elements. The storm was a physical manifestation of the siege they were under, and surviving it together forged a connection stronger than words. When the wind finally died and the sun broke through, they emerged into a world remade in shades of brown. The land was scarred, but their small fortress had held. As they began the arduous task of digging out, Elias knew they had passed a test. They could rely on each other. Silas Cain, however, did not rely on storms. His attacks were more insidious. One morning, Elias found one of his cattle lying dead by the creek, its belly bloated. The water downstream was fouled with a milky substance. Poison. A clear message. Later that week, he found a section of his north fence, cut the wire snipped with a pair of heavy-duty shears not commonly found on a simple homestead. Left behind, caught on a splintered post, was a small scrap of leather, branded with a distinctive K intertwined with a serpent. It was the same brand he had seen on the saddle of one of the men with Henderson. The campaign of intimidation was designed to wear him down, to make him appear careless and unstable to the rest of the town. Elias began his own quiet investigation. At night, he would ride out circling the area, watching the failed homesteads that Cain had acquired. He saw lights where there should have been darkness, saw armed men patrolling properties that were supposedly abandoned. Cain wasn't just buying land. He was building an army, creating a shadow empire on the fringes of redemption. The pieces of the puzzle were coming together, forming a picture of a man with immense ambition and a chilling lack of scruples. His vendetta, Elias was starting to realize, was deeply personal. This wasn't about land. It was about him. The midpoint came on a blistering afternoon when Elias rode into town for supplies. He saw Silas Cain standing on the porch of the saloon, surrounded by Henderson and his men. Cain was no longer a masked phantom from a violent memory. He was tall and impeccably dressed for a man in a dusty frontier town, his face handsome in a severe cold way. He watched Elias approach, a slight knowing smile on his lips. Elias reined in his horse, his hand resting on his thigh, inches from his revolver. The street went quiet. Townspeople froze, sensing the confrontation. Mr. Carver Cain said, his voice smooth and articulate, carrying easily in the still air. "I hear you've been having some trouble on your land. A shame what can happen when a man is distracted." "My troubles started the day you rode into town," Elias said, his voice low and even. Cain chuckled, a dry, mirthless sound. "You wound me. I'm merely a businessman securing assets. It's not my fault some men lack the fortitude to hold on to what's theirs." His eyes cold and gray as a winter sky locked onto Elias's. "But you and our business is of a more personal nature." He stepped forward away from his men. "You carry a locket, I believe. A family heirloom." He let the words hang in the air. "It belonged to my brother's killer." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Elias's hand tensed. "My brother was murdered by cattle rustlers." Was he? Cain's smile widened, a predator's grin. "Justice, Mr. Carver, is a matter of perspective. The official story is often the most convenient one, especially when a family has influence. My brother's name was Jedediah. He and your sainted Daniel were partners. And Daniel, in a fit of greed, tried to take more than his share. He killed my brother in cold blood. The story of rustlers was a lie your family paid for to protect its good name." The saloon doors creaked. Sheriff Burke stood in the doorway, his face a grim mask. Cain ignored him, his focus entirely on Elias. "I am here to collect a debt of blood. Your brother took my brother's life and his future. So I will take your land, your home, your future. I will see you with nothing but the dust you stand on, just as you left my family. This is not about revenge, Carver. This is about balancing the scales." The foundation of Elias's world had crumbled. His quest for vengeance was a lie. He was not the righteous avenger. He was the heir to a debt he never knew he owed. His grief, his guilt, the entire narrative of his life was built on a fiction. He looked at Silas Cain, a man driven by a mirror image of his own pain, and saw not a simple villain, but the devastating complex truth of his past. The revelation in the street left Elias reeling. The certainty that had fueled him the righteous anger of a wronged brother had been replaced by a sickening gray ambiguity. He returned to the homestead in a daze, the world muted and unreal. He explained what happened to Nieli, his words clipped and strained. She listened in silence, her dark eyes watching his face, offering not judgment, but a steady grounding presence. Silas Cain, having declared open war, immediately escalated his attacks. He knew he couldn't break Elias with physical threats alone. He needed to turn the entire town against him. His new weapon was Nieli. Henderson and his men began spreading rumors claiming she was using Apache witchcraft to sour milk and spook cattle. The whispers grew more venomous when a valuable pocket watch went missing from the general store. The next day, Henderson publicly accused Nieli of the theft, claiming he'd seen her lurking near the store at night. The town, already wary, began to side with Cain. The fragile respect Nieli had earned was eroding under a constant barrage of suspicion. Elias found himself defending her to faces that had become closed and hostile. The siege was tightening. The breaking point came ironically not from an act of violence, but from a child's carelessness. On a sweltering afternoon, a cry of pure maternal terror cut through the town. The storekeeper's young son, chasing a strayed dog, had fallen through the rotten wooden cover of the old community, well behind the church. By the time Elias and Nieli arrived, a panicked, helpless crowd had gathered. The boy's mother was hysterical. Men shouted useless suggestions. The rope they had was too short. Elias felt a grim sense of foreboding. If the boy died, the town's grief and anger would need a target, and Cain had already painted one on Nieli's back. But Nieli did not hesitate. Pushing through the hostile crowd, she dropped to her stomach at the well's edge. Her voice, calm and clear, cut through the chaos. "Bring me rope. All of it. And blankets." The men stared, but Elias's voice, a roar of command, spurred them to action. "Do as she says now." Working with a swift, practiced efficiency that stunned the onlookers, Nieli directed them. She wasn't just a bystander. She was a leader. She had them braid 2 ropes together for strength and length. She showed Elias how to tie a complex series of knots around her waist, a harness that would distribute her weight. "I've hauled water from pits deeper than this," she told him, her voice low and steady, answering the question in his eyes. Without another word, she was over the edge, descending into the darkness. Elias and 2 other men braced themselves, playing out the rope as she guided herself down the narrow, crumbling shaft. The crowd held its breath. Moments later, her voice echoed up, faint but clear. "I have him. He's alive. Pull." They hauled on the rope, their muscles straining. Slowly, Nieli emerged into the light, the unconscious boy held securely against her chest. She was covered in grime, her face pale with exhaustion, her ribs screaming in protest. But her grip on the child was unbreakable. As she was pulled over the edge, the crowd erupted not in suspicion, but in a collective gasp of awe and relief. The boy's mother snatched him up, her sobs now of gratitude. The storekeeper's wife rushed to Nieli's side, pressing a water-soaked cloth to her forehead. "You saved him," she whispered, her eyes filled with tears. Henderson and his men, who had been watching from the edge of the crowd with smug certainty, now looked uneasy. Their carefully constructed narrative of the dangerous savage had just been shattered by an act of undeniable heroism. Sheriff Burke, who had arrived moments before, took in the scene, his gaze resting on Nieli with a newfound respect. The tide of public opinion had just turned violently and irrevocably against Silas Kane. The sky had been threatening all day, the air growing heavy, and still the light taking on a sickly yellow hue. As Elias and Nieli worked to secure the homestead, a low guttural rumble started in the west, the sound of a storm far greater than the one they had weathered before. This was not a passing squall. It was a force of nature, an apocalyptic wall of black cloud and churning dust that was about to descend upon them. The wind arrived, first a shotgun blast of grit and fury that ripped the latch from the chicken coop door. The world outside the cabin dissolved into a roaring brown chaos. Visibility dropped to zero. The howling of the wind was a physical presence pressing on the walls, seeking entry. It was the perfect cover for an attack. And then they came. Figures emerged from the maelstrom, indistinct shapes moving through the blinding dust. Silas Kane and his men, using the storm's biblical fury as their cloak. The first gunshot was almost lost in the wind's roar, a sharp crack that splintered the wood of the doorframe next to Elias's head. Inside, Elias yelled, shoving Nieli toward the cabin as he drew his revolver. The fight was a desperate, brutal ballet of shadows and chaos. A man lunged through the doorway, and Elias met him with a shoulder, sending him sprawling. Nieli swung a heavy iron skillet connecting with another attacker's head with a sickening thud. The battle spilled from the small cabin into the yard and then into the barn, where the wind shrieked through the gaps in the boards, and the air was a choking fog of dust and hay. Elias fought with a cold, desperate clarity. This was no longer about a ghost from the past or a complicated debt. It was about protecting the future he was building. The woman who stood beside him, her face grim and determined, as she wielded a pitchfork like a warrior. He finally cornered Silas Kane in the back of the barn near the hayloft. The storm raged outside, rattling the entire structure. Kane's fine clothes were torn and filthy, a wild, feverish light in his eyes. He had lost, and he knew it. The town would not stand with him now. This was his last desperate gamble. "You think this is over?" Kane spat, raising his pistol. Elias fired first. His shot tore through the flesh of Kane's shoulder, sending the gun clattering into the hay. Kane staggered back, clutching his arm, a snarl of pain and fury on his face. Elias advanced his own revolver, steady aimed at Kane's heart. This was the moment, the culmination of years of grief and months of hunting. Revenge was inches away. My brother Elias growled the words torn from his throat. Kane laughed, a ragged, broken sound that was half cough, half sob. "Your brother," he choked out, leaning against a support beam. "You still don't get it, do you, Carver? You're still clinging to that pretty little lie." He pushed himself upright, his eyes burning with a hatred that transcended pain. Daniel wasn't just my partner. He was my right hand. We ran schemes from Kansas to the territories. But he was weak. He had a conscience that gnawed at him, and he got greedy. The confession poured out of him, a torrent of poison meant to inflict one final mortal wound. That day he wasn't just trying to take Jedediah's share. He was going to turn us both in. He'd had enough, he said, wanted to go straight. He pulled a gun on his own partner's. Kane's voice cracked. Jedediah tried to talk him down. He loved your brother like his own. And Daniel shot him in the gut and left him to bleed out in the dirt. I killed Daniel, yes. But it wasn't murder. It was justice. Your brother wasn't a victim, Carver. He was just as rotten as the rest of us. He just wasn't as smart. The truth hit Elias with the force of a physical blow, more stunning than any bullet. The sainted memory of his brother, the flawless icon he had carried in his heart for years, shattered into a million pieces. Daniel wasn't a hero. He wasn't even an innocent victim. He was a flawed, frightened man who had made a fatal mistake. Cain watched him, a triumphant, malicious gleam in his eyes, even as blood soaked his shirt. He had delivered the killing blow after all. Elias stood over the man who had tormented him, the revolver in his hand, feeling impossibly heavy. He could pull the trigger. He could call it vengeance for Cain's campaign of terror, for the poison and the threats. He could end it. But he looked at Cain, a man twisted and destroyed by a grief that mirrored his own. And he saw not a monster, but a tragedy. Killing him would not restore Daniel's honor, because Daniel had no honor to restore. It would only make Elias a killer, just like the man before him. His finger eased off the trigger. He lowered the gun with a roar of pure anguish. For the brother he had lost twice, once to death and now to truth. Elias swung the heavy barrel of his revolver in a sharp arc, striking Cain across the temple. Silas Cain crumpled to the barn floor unconscious. The choice was made. Justice, not vengeance. As the fury of the storm began to subside, the howling wind softening to a mournful sigh, a new sound reached them, the steady beat of horses' hooves. Sheriff Burke, riding out to check on them as soon as the worst of the storm had passed, appeared at the wide barn door, his shotgun held at the ready. He took in the scene with his weary, all-seeing eyes. The bodies of Cain's men, the damaged Nieli, leaning against a post, breathing heavily, and Elias standing over the unconscious form of Silas Cain, a length of rope in his hands. Elias didn't offer an explanation. He simply finished tying Cain's hands and gestured with his chin. "He's yours, Sheriff." Burke nodded slowly, a deep understanding passing between the two men. He had pieced together enough from the town's talk and his own observations to know this was more than a simple dispute. Justice, then, Burke said, his voice filled with a weary respect. "Not vengeance." "Good choice, Carver." He and his deputy, who had arrived behind him, rounded up the remaining conscious thugs and carted Silas Cain off to the town jail. As the lawmen disappeared into the receding dust, a profound quiet settled over the homestead. The aftermath was a landscape of wreckage, both outside and in. Elias and Nieli moved through the debris of their home, their bodies aching, their minds numb. They tended to their wounds in silence, Nieli stitching a cut on Elias's arm with the same steady hands she had used on her own skin. Later, as the last of the bruised twilight faded from the sky, Elias finally spoke. He sat at the table, the silver locket in his hand, turning it over and over. He didn't tell Nieli the ugly details of his brother's betrayal, but he told her of the weight of the ghost he had been chasing. "Everything I thought I knew about him." "It was a lie," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I spent years carrying this guilt, this anger, and it was all for nothing." Nieli came and stood behind him, placing a hand on his shoulder. Her touch was light but firm, a point of solid ground in his swirling grief. "A man's ghost is only as heavy as you let it be," she said, her voice quiet but sure. "Daniel's path was not yours. His choices do not define you. What defines you is what you did here tonight. You chose mercy when you could have chosen death. That is your truth." Her words cut through his pain, offering not an easy comfort, but a difficult, necessary clarity. He looked from the locket in his hand to her face, illuminated by the soft lamplight, and understood. His future was not chained to Daniel's past. It was here in this battered cabin, with this resilient woman who had faced down her own ghosts and chosen to stand with him. The long night of his grief was finally over. Months passed. The seasons turned, healing the land just as time began to heal the wounds of the past. The homestead, once a symbol of Elias's retreat from the world, became a testament to his and Nieli's resilience. They rebuilt what was broken stronger than before. A new solid door hung on the cabin. The barn walls were reinforced, and along the ridge a windbreak of brush planted low, just as Nieli had shown him, held the soil protecting a burgeoning crop of corn. The town of Redemption had settled into a state of grudging respect. The story of the final battle at the Carver homestead and of Silas Kane's confession had spread, cementing Elias and Nieli, not as outsiders, but as survivors who had earned their place. The deed to the homestead filed in both their names was now officially recognized as a marriage certificate by the county clerk, a fact Sheriff Burke had quietly seen to. Their partnership, forged in violence and hardship, was now rooted in law and land. One clear, cool morning, Elias walked to the highest point of his property, a small ridge that overlooked the entire homestead. The corn stood tall in the fields below, and the cabin rested peacefully in the valley, a thin curl of smoke rising from its chimney. In his hand, he held the silver locket. He opened it one last time, looking at the tiny, faded image of the smiling boy who had been his brother. He acknowledged the love he had felt for that boy and the pain of his loss. He also acknowledged the flawed, frightened man Daniel had become, a man whose choices had led to tragedy. He finally understood that he could hold both truths at once. The idealized memory was gone, replaced by a complicated, painful, and human reality. With a deep breath that felt like the first clean one he had taken in years, he dug a small hole in the rich earth with the heel of his boot. He placed the locket inside and covered it, pressing the soil down firmly. He was not burying his brother, but the weight of him, the guilt, the anger, the quest for a vengeance that was never his to claim. He was letting the past go. As he turned to walk back toward the cabin, he saw Nieli waiting for him at the fence line. She didn't ask what he had been doing. She didn't need to. She simply held out her hand to him. He took it, her calloused fingers lacing with his, and they stood there for a long moment, watching the sun climb higher in the sky. The quiet surprise of his new life settled over him. He had come to this land seeking solitude, a place to hide from his ghosts. Instead, he had found a home built not of wood and sod, but of shared work, mutual respect, and a quiet, unshakable love. It was a life more real and fulfilling than any he had ever imagined. They turned and walked back toward the house, side by side. Their home established their future, stretching out before them like the open prairie, vast and full of promise.